All right, Chris, thank you so much for being here today. Introduce yourself to everyone here in the audience.
Yeah, hey Jillian, thanks for having me. And hello, everybody in the audience. My name is Chris Splinter. I'm a senior product manager on the Kubernetes team here at AWS and love building some awesome Kubernetes features for all of you. And it's been awesome to see the things that you need and how you're really standardizing on it across a bunch of different use cases.
Yeah, and what we're specifically going to talk about is EKS on Outpost. But before we get there, I think we should kind of just let's get everyone on the same page of like what is EKS. I'm sure we've got people from different skill sets and backgrounds.
Yeah, so Amazon EKS is a managed Kubernetes service that customers can use to run Kubernetes in the AWS cloud and also on premises in their data centers on Outposts. And really the core benefit of Amazon EKS is that we manage the availability and scalability of the Kubernetes control plane nodes. And those nodes are responsible for scheduling containers, managing application availability, and there's a lot of different management tasks that Kubernetes control plane is responsible for.
Yeah, that's great. And I know there's a lot of people here that are newer to AWS and they just want to find out resources where they can learn AWS, learn EKS. So we've actually got an event called Awesome Day that is coming up. We're going to drop a link to it. So make sure you sign up, and whether that's fundamentals or maybe diving deeper into different services, that is a fantastic place to go. So now let's get into more about EKS. And now we've got this new feature launch with EKS Outposts. And I know a lot of people probably are wondering, okay, so you've got EKS on Outposts, you've got EKS Anywhere. What's the difference? When should I use one versus the other?
Yeah, it's a great question. And before we dive into that, I guess I should also explain what EKS Anywhere is, because it is a little bit different from the Amazon EKS that I just described. And so EKS Anywhere is an installable software package that's fully supported by AWS. And customers can take that package and run it on their own hardware in their own data centers or edge locations. And it really simplifies the cluster provisioning as well as the cluster lifecycle management through automation, both tooling and other things like GitOps and Terraform and things like that. And so that is EKS Anywhere, but then we also have Amazon EKS on Outposts. And when we talk about these two offerings with customers, there's really three differentiating factors. And so we always first start at the infrastructure level. If customers need to run on their own infrastructure, then EKS Anywhere is the best fit for them. But if customers are able and open to invest in new infrastructure, then EKS on Outposts could be a great fit. And as Jeff described earlier in the show, there's a range of form factors from 42U racks to 1U and 2U servers, depending on the type of use case. So we always start at the infrastructure level, and that kind of helps steer the conversation. And then after the infrastructure level comes connectivity. Outposts in general are a fully connected infrastructure offering where it has to be connected back up to the AWS region so that you can use all of the same AWS APIs that you typically use and other AWS services like EKS. So if customers are able to be fully connected back to the region, then again, Outposts might be a great fit. But if customers need to run fully disconnected or primarily disconnected, that's really where EKS Anywhere is probably a better fit for them. And the last one that's also very important is the cluster management. With EKS on Outposts, this is the same EKS that you run in the cloud. And so that Kubernetes control plane availability and scalability is managed by AWS, whereas EKS Anywhere is a customer managed offering. And so customers are responsible to manage that cluster lifecycle, and AWS is not like reaching in and trying to orchestrate that EKS Anywhere cluster.
I know there's probably a lot of people that are like, wow, that was so much knowledge that you just dropped. I wish I could get a replay of that. And fortunately, there is. This is all going to be on YouTube afterwards. So I know I'm going to be listening to it again, and I'll share it with my customers. So definitely make sure you check it out on YouTube for all this. And of course, we've got people in the chat here from the EKS team. So if you have questions, make sure you put them in the chat, and we'll definitely want to address them. So I know you've got a demo for us, because a lot of this sounds like, okay, I get it in my head, but I think once you start to see it, then it starts to make more sense. So can you show us?
Yeah, and I'll talk about the new feature that we launched as I walk through the demo.
Yeah, perfect.
And so the new feature that we launched is called local clusters for EKS on Outposts. And so what you're seeing in this slide here is, or on this screen here, is the Amazon EKS console. And I'm just showing that I have Outposts available in my account. So somebody either shared that with me or I own one of those Outposts with my AWS account. And so when I go over now to the EKS console and I go to the normal create cluster experience, because I have an outpost associated with my account, I now see this new panel at the top of the configure cluster page, which is the Kubernetes control plane location. And so I can choose to either run the Kubernetes control plane in an AWS region in the AWS cloud, or with this new feature, I can run it on Outposts. And one of the key reasons why I would want to run it on Outposts is because with local clusters, the entire Kubernetes cluster is going to be co-located on that Outpost machine. And so even if my Outpost loses connectivity back to the AWS cloud, I can continue to issue cluster operations, and that cluster is going to continue to run just as it normally would. And what we're going to walk through here is how to deploy one of those local clusters. And then I'll also demo some of that disconnected experience. And so I selected this AWS Outpost option here. And now I'm going to go ahead and select one of the outposts that we have. And then this next portion here is new as well. And one of the key differences with local clusters from the usual Amazon EKS that you would use in the cloud is that we're deploying this Kubernetes control plane into your account, the customer's account on the outpost. And we're consuming capacity that you bought on for that outpost, an EC2 that constrained capacity on the outpost. And so we want to make it very clear the capacity that we're using on the outpost that's running in your data center. And so I go ahead and select an instance type, and there's going to be 3 Kubernetes control plane replicas. And I'll type in a cluster name, Chris Cluster 2, Kubernetes version 1.21. And I'll also choose a cluster role. And this is all almost exactly the same as the experience would be if you were creating an EKS cluster in the cloud. Again, same console, same everything. There's just a few subtleties in terms of what is and isn't available because of the uniqueness of the Outpost environment. And one of those unique characteristics is that only IPv4 is available. And so we say here that the control plane is set to Outpost. You can only use IPv4 address family. And also
for the folks that are new to actually EKS, can you just give a high level of what did that actually mean when you created those replicas?
Yeah, so in Kubernetes, the control plane should run across at least 3 replicas so that if you lose one of the instances, that cluster will continue to run and that control plane will still be healthy. And so the replicas mean that on each instance, there's going to be a number of Kubernetes control plane components like the API server, etcd, and a few other schedulers and the controller manager as well.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so I'll continue going through this here. Again, cluster endpoint access is set to private because the Kubernetes cluster is running on an outpost instead of in the region. And so in order to connect to it, you have to go over the local gateway, which is a feature of AWS Outposts. And so really that's it for the cluster creation experience. And now I do want to go to a cluster that I've already created just to poke around a little bit. And again, this is the same EKS console that you would use for an EKS cluster in region. But because we're deploying it on Outpost into the customer's account, you can actually see the nodes that are being used for that Kubernetes control plane. And in this case, they're the ones that are marked as not ready. And I know that looks a little bit scary, but they're marked as not ready because in Kubernetes, that means that they're not ready for workloads to be scheduled onto them. And at this time, and in general, you typically don't want to run your application workloads on the Kubernetes control plane. And you want to run those on separate nodes that are in the cluster because if you do run it on the control plane and a node goes down, that means that not only is one of your application instances down, but also the Kubernetes control plane is down. So you want to separate those for high availability.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to like, best practices like with running EKS on AWS, because some of these visuals of like the architecture diagram, I think that's going to help kind of put these concepts, I think that like Chris is just quickly going over together.
Absolutely. And we should definitely share some documentation as well, because all of this is spelled out very clear in docs, and it also goes into a lot more detail about everything. I know it's a lot. I'm giving a lot of information right now. And I know some viewers may not necessarily be able to connect the dots here for these new concepts like Outposts. But yeah, the documentation is an excellent source for all that information. And I just want to go through a few more things here before we jump into the disconnected experience. So again, this cluster is running on the Outpost because of this Kubernetes control plane location information here. And what you see is the Outpost ARN, which tells you that the cluster itself is running on that Outpost.
Perfect. Yeah. So I guess once you've got it actually running, what are some things that maybe a developer should consider?
Yeah, and I think the demo that we're going to go through here is also a good representation of that.
Oh, perfect.
I do want to show first, though, that this instance here is a worker node, and it is hosting an application in a pod. And so we can look in here, and there are 5 pods running on this node. And if we go down, we can look at the pods that are running on the node. And we can click on this EKS sample deployment. And what this sample deployment is, it's just a very simple Nginx web server that's running on the worker node, and it's just Nginx. And so now what I would like to show is, dive into that Kubernetes cluster and do a little bit of the disconnected simulation so that we can connect the dots in terms of the value of this new feature.
Yeah, and for those maybe who just joined, we're talking about EKS on Outposts. We also have a survey. We pick these topics because we really want to do our best to help you be able to learn AWS, get started. But we want to know what you think. What is it that you want to know? What's great about the show? What can we do better? So please fill out our survey. I actually read them, all of the answers. So please fill out the survey for us.
All right, so Jillian, I'm going to hop over here to my terminal real quick.
Perfect.
So I'll stop sharing this screen.
And I saw some people were asking questions. Keep it coming. Again, this is really for you. We really want to help make sure you get the answers that you need. And I love seeing where all these people are coming from. I mean, it's probably late. I see Vikran from Bulgaria. We've got Brazil. Let's see. We've got Maryland with the crab. I love that. I mean, pretty just amazing. I think someone put a taco and a burrito going on as their emojis. Chile, Hernan, hello. I think Ukraine, Felix from Costa Rica, Claudio from Argentina, welcome. Oh, India, thanks, Nitish, welcome.
All right. So we'll walk through a little bit here about what the disconnected experience looks like. And so what I'm using now is a server that's running in the on-premises data center where the Outpost is installed. And I'm connecting to that server over the local network and through the local gateway, which is a feature of AWS Outposts. And so I just ran the list clusters command from the AWS CLI, and you can see that I have 2 clusters showing there. And I'll run describe cluster here just to show that this looks very much like a normal EKS cluster. And there is this new Outpost config, which shows the Outpost ARN, which is where the Kubernetes control plane is running. And I will go ahead and show that you can see those nodes in the cluster. We have our 3 not ready Kubernetes control plane nodes and then 1 ready worker node. And what I am doing here is issuing these kubectl commands to the Kubernetes API server over the local network via a new feature that we recently GA'd for Outposts called direct VPC routing, which advertises the private IPs of the EC2 instances on the Outpost over the local network. And so I have this sample app deployment here. And if I hit that sample app, you'll see it's just responding with what a kind of vanilla Nginx web server would show. And all of these kubectl commands here are going through AWS IAM. And we know that based on this portion of the kube config, which is calling STS in the region, and it's going through IAM that's also hosted in the region. And before this session, I created another, and it's probably like, wow, that's a huge blob of text, but I created another admin user using X509 certificates, which is a like native Kubernetes method to authenticate to your Kubernetes API server. And these are pretty standard certificates, but they look like an encrypted blob of text because that's basically what they are. But the reason why we enabled the use of these certificates is so that you can continue to authenticate to your cluster even while you're disconnected from the AWS region. And so what I'm going to show here is I'm going to disconnect my cluster from the region, and then I'm going to scale the Nginx application from 1 replica to 2 replicas to show that you can continue to do Kubernetes operations. And what you see here is there's 1 pod running right now. That's 1 replica. And I'm going to run a little script that will disconnect the cluster from the AWS region. And this takes just a couple seconds.
I love that you just called out in that, like this, a bit of security. You gave a little bit of a teaser because I think security with anything, and especially with like Kubernetes, like that's probably, we could do that like a whole hour, I think, like just on that. So I think like we'll definitely like link some, get some links to security, you know, in EKS because it's definitely something that's a constant, never-ending improvement process. So make sure you're thinking about security as you are building.
Definitely, and that's one very important thing too. Like especially with on-prem applications, what I kind of glanced over before was that only private endpoint access is available for this cluster, which means it can only be reached over the customer's local network or via an instance that's in the same VPC. And so we're not at all publishing that Kubernetes API server endpoint to the external world, which I would think is pretty important for on-premises use cases. So now, while we were talking there, our Kubernetes cluster is now disconnected from the AWS region. And we can confirm that because if we run the kubectl command that we were running before, which uses IAM, it's no longer working. And it's going to timeout. And I'll just give it a few more seconds for, I don't know, dramatic pause. But clearly, it's not returning the same thing that it was returning before. And so I'll kill that. But what I can do now is use that admin certificate that I was talking about to show that I can still use that admin certificate. And we know we're using it because of this -- kube config that basically tells kubectl, hey, use this other user instead of the default user. And so I can still use that certificate in order to query my cluster. And so now I'm going to scale the application from 1 node to 2 nodes. And we can see that it's scaled because there are now 2 pods running in this state. And there are several caveats here. Again, this is like the simplest example of what you can do while disconnected. I have a single node. The application was already running on that node, so the container images are cached. I want to make sure if anybody's going to try this out, make sure you read our documentation, you understand what you can and what you can't do. And you also understand what you should set up beforehand if you need certain functionality while you're disconnected.
Yeah, and watch this on YouTube, which I know I'm going to be doing again. Hopefully you all will join me in that learning experience. So, wow, Chris, there's like so many things I think that people probably want to know. They're probably excited to get started. So what are some resources? What should people do if they want to start learning more about EKS on Outposts?
Yeah, and I wanted to just show that I reconnected the cluster, and now that original kubectl command is working. So yeah, if people want to learn more about EKS on Outposts, I would say go to the EKS homepage, the PDP. They can also go to the documentation to learn more, but basically all of those resources are on the external EKS homepage on the AWS website.
Love it. All right, Chris, thank you so much. You are a wealth of knowledge. And I know people are so excited. I'm excited right now for what you just launched and shared with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and happy Friday, everyone.